It's just a bit surreal to have real people to preach to today. Excuse me. Since I began my call as your pastor just a few months ago, I've only been able to imagine you in these pews. And here you are, beginning to emerge from the wilderness of global pandemic together in the flesh. Some of you have already mostly emerged, cannonballed back into your life with the assurance of vaccination. And the precautions that we're taking here might seem a little bit like overkill. And some of you are still firmly rooted in pandemic world with children or other vulnerable people to protect, jobs lost or shifted, with your own grief and trauma weighing you down in your pew, just cautiously dipping your toe in the water today. Some of you are joining us from your homes. Some of you aren't quite sure what to feel or think about this new hybrid way of being church together. Whatever unique mix of excitement and anxiety and gratitude and frustration you bring today, it is all welcome here. Come as you are. And can I just say how proud I am to be your pastor? It's an honor to serve a church that, regardless of how each of us are feeling, makes it our priority to care for the most vulnerable. Even if that means things look different. There are masks and ribbons on the pews. Today, in part 3 of our Emerging from the Wilderness series, we are journeying with a kindred spirit, a man who also goes to great lengths to protect the vulnerable and who is willing to change his life in radical ways to do so. Joseph, husband of Mary, father of Jesus. We first meet Joseph as he's preparing to end things with Mary. She's pregnant and the baby isn't his. He owes her nothing. He has no responsibility for this child that isn't his, but he's not looking for revenge. He just wants to move on with his life. When a divine messenger comes to him in a dream and instructs him to marry her anyway. It's a big ask, right? But this is God's child. So Joseph steps into that role of father. And he had no idea what he was getting himself into. Like none of us do when we become parents either. And I don't just mean the diaper changes and sleepless nights for Joseph. When Jesus was a toddler, he was already a threat to the powers that be. You remember the story. The Magi told King Herod about the birth of a promised Messiah child. Herod, like many of our own government leaders, will stop at nothing to protect his power. He orders all children in Bethlehem under 2 years of age to be killed. But before this murderous spree, Joseph has another divine encounter, this time a warning. And Joseph, like many of you, will stop at nothing to protect his child, the child he has adopted as his own. Suddenly, he is a refugee, fleeing violence, leading his family to Egypt, where they stay for a few years until Herod dies. By the way, it's worth noting that Jesus spends a good portion of his childhood growing up in Africa. When Herod dies, Joseph gets another angelic dream that gives him the all clear, and the Holy Family begins to emerge from hiding. They go back to Israel, but there's still some risk. Before the angelic messenger can even make it back to Joseph, he's already got that parental intuition that something isn't right, that fatherly spidey sense. He's afraid to go back home. Another dream confirms his fears, so he leads his family out of the wilderness of their time away, but not back to where they started. They go to a new home, one that is further away from the seats of power and the dangerous men who occupy them, to a little backwoods town called Nazareth. In Matthew's version of the story, this is how Jesus becomes Jesus of Nazareth, because of this awful set of circumstances that lead his family on a long and difficult and seemingly meaningless detour. They get back home, sort of, but home isn't the same. They are not the same. Sometimes I wonder if after the 5th angelic visit that Joseph receives, he might have regretted saying yes to the first one. He must have wondered, "What are you doing, God? Where are you?" He couldn't have known what he was getting himself into. The story might feel foreign to us with its divine encounters and murderous tyrants, but we all know, especially after the last 15 months, what it's like to have the decisions of power-hungry politicians put the most vulnerable among us at risk, don't we? Herod sacrificed his people for his power, and our leaders sacrificed our people for the economy. We know what it's like to stop at nothing to protect our children. Most of us didn't flee to a neighboring country, but we fled from danger by doing things we never could have imagined. Keeping kids home from school, working from home, quitting jobs, sanitizing groceries in a hallway, wearing masks, living with uncertainty and fear, estranged from the lives that we knew before. We know what it's like to begin to feel safe, only to realize that the risk isn't quite over. To get back or move forward from a long and difficult and seemingly meaningless detour and feel like we're starting over. We might be wondering with Joseph, where are you, God? What are you doing? It's okay if we can't see the answer. I doubt that Joseph could see the answer, even with the angelic messengers, as his life spiraled from upstanding citizen to non-traditional father to refugee. But one thing that I love about Matthew's version of the story is that God's hand is active, even if those in the story can't see it at the time. Over and over again, you may have noticed when Jonathan read, we hear this refrain. This was to fulfill what had been spoken in the scriptures, what had been spoken by the prophets. The Holy Family flees to Egypt. This is to fulfill the words of the prophet. Out of Egypt I will call my son. The mothers of Bethlehem mourn their children. This is to fulfill the words of the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Joseph is rerouted to settle in Nazareth instead of Bethlehem. This is to fulfill the words of the prophet. He will be called a Nazarene. I want to be careful here because I don't think that this means that God caused or condoned the pain and violence and hardship in Joseph's story or in our stories. I think it means that even there, even in the most unpredictable, the most devastating, the most disappointing and scariest times, God is tracing a picture in what looks to us like meaningless dots. Even in the gloom of night, God is connecting the sparks of light in our lives and forming us into a rich constellation. Maybe you're in a place now where you can start to see it take shape. Or maybe you're in a place where you're calling BS. And that's okay either way. My guess is that Joseph would have called BS too as he spiraled from citizen to father to refugee in just the course of a few years. From where we sit, of course, this seemingly meaningless trajectory of the Holy Family's journey makes sense. From where we sit, we can see that this makes Jesus who he is, a Messiah who is from and for the margins. If we can't see our big picture yet, we might still be able to get a glimpse of God's work in our wilderness on a smaller scale. Look at your neighbor. Just look at your neighbor. Yes, thank you. As annoying as wearing a mask can be, it is also an opportunity. When you see your neighbor, you are seeing them wear their care for you on their face. When I look at you all, I see your love for our children, for our guests that may join us. When we put our masks on for now, when we do our new and different passing of the peace motions, we are physically embodying our love for our neighbor. That's got to be shaping our souls, y'all. That's doing something on our insides too, don't you think? Because of the pandemic, wilderness, and almost every interaction that we have, we're also practicing the concept of consent. Asking before we go in for a hug, communicating clearly about our comfort levels, about our boundaries. And our kids are going to grow up thinking that is normal. Praise be to God. It's not too late for the rest of us either to be formed in this way with respect for each other, honoring each other's bodies and boundaries. This is formative stuff. Throughout the past year, we've seen just how responsible we all are to each other, to the whole world. In a year of disconnection, we've seen how intricately connected our lives and our health is with strangers in our local grocery store or with people on the other side of the world. This might make us resentful sometimes and cynical about the selfishness of humanity, but it might also expand our vision of the covenant solidarity, the care necessary that binds us together as God's beloved children. There is no denying it now. We absolutely are our siblings' keeper. We know that for sure. While our stories like Joseph's might look haphazard and broken and unpredictable right now, God is still forming our lives in big ways and in little ways. God is forming our children's lives. God is forming our church life out of these broken fragments that we are living in. I mean, look what you've already done, church. Look how you've already been changed. You've sent out $125,000 that you didn't plan on having for COVID relief in our community when you didn't know what would happen with your own finances. You gave extravagantly and selflessly. You have forged brand new ways of worshiping together in the last year and a half, online and in person and outdoors. You've pivoted in ministries like God's Family Dinner to meet this moment that we're in. You have come together to call a new pastor during a global pandemic without ever having met her. Thank you. You are braver. You are even more generous. You are even more innovative than you were before, beloveds. And that is saying something about this group. In our story today, Joseph didn't know what he was getting himself into. His life changed radically when he followed through on the commitment that he made in a situation he could not have foreseen. 15 months ago, we did not know what we were getting into. How will our lives be changed? How will our church be reshaped when we follow through with these commitments to protect the vulnerable, to come alongside our neighbors, to take responsibility for people we are not responsible for, how will we be changed? We are home, sort of. But home is not the same, and we are not the same. What new sources of courage have you found in the wilderness? What unknown strength and resilience and flexibility have you found inside yourselves and inside each other? What divine dreams are guiding us forward as we make our new home here together? As we emerge from wilderness pandemic, whether with cannonballs or just dipping our toe in the water, we have to do the holy work of figuring out who we are on the other side, who we are becoming together. How will we extend our courageous love and welcome into this new world? How will we take responsibility for those that the world expects us to leave behind? How has the wilderness shaped and formed you? How has it formed us? Beloveds, as we regather, may we begin to connect the dots of God's story for us, even here, even now. Amen.